I read Anger and Forgiveness, Resentment, Generosity, Justice by Martha Nussbaum. This is the first time that I've read this book. It is a work of philosophy, nonfiction, and it's kind of aimed at an academic audience. This came out in 2018, around the same time as the other book of hers that I read, The Monarchy of Fear. And like that book, it deals with kind of a philosophy of emotions and how that interacts with the legal system and with government in general. And so Nussbaum tries to examine the philosophical tradition around anger and identify what feels correct and incorrect to her about its characterization. And so we go back to things like Aristotle and the ways that he thought of anger. So we're going like way back in the philosophical tradition. And then she's also bringing in things with like neuroscience that's more, up to the minute kind of technology that's examining which parts of the brain are involved in anger. And then all kinds of literature and philosophy in between Aristotle and the neuroscience. So there's quite a bit of things to consider. The important things about what she characterizes as anger is that she divides it into different groups, I think. And so the main two categories that she has are like a kind of anger that wants payback, that wants retribution. And this was a more traditional kind of anger and an emotion that has to do with social ranking a lot of times. And then the other kind of anger is an anger that is transformative, she says, that is an anger that starts to look towards a solution outside of revenge. And so the reason that she's thinking about anger is because she's interested in how society punishes people who break the law or who are trespassing in some kind of social norm and causing a problem. And like, how do we deal with those people as a society? And so she looks at the plays of Aeschylus, and in particular, the ending of one of the plays has kind of the establishment of Athens, and the primary part of the legend that Aeschylus innovates in that establishment is that Athena transforms the Furies, who are associated with a kind of retributive justice, is what she calls it, or like an eye for an eye kind of justice. She transforms these monstrous supernatural creatures of the Furies into rational human characters, and then says that henceforth justice will be determined by juries and courts instead of the Furies. And so this takes kind of the passion and emotion out of justice, or an idea of justice. It takes out the idea of like equivalent violence in order to recover some kind of like lost ranking or property or something. She points out that all of this is kind of irrational, that if somebody does blind you, blinding them doesn't really recover your sight, right? So an eye for an eye doesn't really make sense if we want a better society. All it does is maybe give the person satisfaction who was blinded in the first place. And only kind of temporary satisfaction, and overall does a lot of harm to the community, most likely. And so in the play, the idea here is that the Furies become human, and that the type of justice that's going to be meted out from now on is going to be justice that's based on the law and not justice that's based on anger and retribution. that law is going to deliver justice that is more impartial. And that impartiality leaves room for kind of a rational planning of the well being of the society as a whole. And so you're not going to be focused so much on an outcome that's going to be satisfactory towards the victim, but for the community overall, what's going to be best for them. And emotions might not come into it very much at all. She spends a lot of the early book, on the one hand, defining anger, and then on the other hand, illustrating the ways in which retribution is a lost cause, basically, how it doesn't amount to very much, and how the feelings of anger tend to lead us away from any possible justice in a situation. And in fact, the more heinous the act that requires justice and inspires anger, probably the worse the reaction is going to be to that, and the less, like, the more angry you get over something, the less likely justice is going to happen, because you're just going to be looking for retribution. And so she brings up cases of like murder and rape, and that there's nothing that can be done in those cases to recover what's been lost. And so doing violence to the perpetrator does no good for the victim or for the rest of society. And so we have to think about other ways to construct justice that prioritizes the community. So what's the point of prioritizing the community when we do actually feel these emotions, and there can be some kind of satisfaction that we can get by getting revenge on people? Like, even if it's temporary, even if we feel bad about it later, we could at least have that small satisfaction in the moment. Why worry at all about what's best for the community when, an individual has been affected and the individual can get some kind of retribution? Well, for one thing, this creates feuds and networks of people who start to fight each other, and the fighting never ends, right? Because, like, somebody comes and pokes out my eye, I go and poke out that guy's eye in revenge, and then his family member goes and pokes out my family member's eye in revenge, and then they poke out somebody else's eye in revenge, and on and on and on and on and on like that, right? Like, it never will end. We'll have these networks of resentment, and the conflicts will last long beyond the people who started the problem in the first place. So that's one problem, is that retribution is just going to start a cycle of violence that might not have an ending within the lifetime of the people who perpetuate it. Another reason to not have retribution is because it constructs a society in which violence is simply less likely to happen. And so we're not pouring our energy as individuals and groups into committing violence and policing violence, like making sure that someone's not attacking our group and that we are effectively attacking other groups. Instead of worrying about all of that, we can instead pour our energies into community building that's going to raise the standard of living and security for everyone in the community. And so this is just like, where are we going to direct our energies? Towards murdering each other, or, towards enriching everyone in the community? And so I think she's making an appeal to that if we are rational actors in society, that anger should not have a place in our government structure, and that the idea of, like, someone offending your honor, or, going into public and calling you a coward or something, and therefore you say that you're going to fight a duel to the death with them to prove that you're not a coward, and then you kill that person, and now you haven't lost your standing in the community because you murdered them. That's creating a society and fostering an environment where a lot of energy is putting in to people's egos and it's destroying lives that could contribute otherwise to the community. And so it's a waste of resources if you want to think of people as resources. And so the anger, it tends to either come in the form, when it's retributive, of worrying about your rank. So like I just mentioned, somebody calls you out in the community and you respond, or as a reaction, a more natural reaction to having something taken from you that can't be retrieved. So like rape, murder, maiming, bodily injury, these kinds of things. Theft of an intellectual kind. And she talks a lot about the Stoics, about their approach to anger, and how basically they're just not fans of it. And they believe that, you should cultivate a kind of attitude where anger does not influence your choices, where you're able to step past anger very quickly, or you don't feel it at all. And how this would be, useful for society to construct itself in that way. And mostly it's about kind of having a lot of self-control, which is what the Stoics were really into. They don't want to be controlled by anything. And that's where she talks about this kind of transitional anger, where you get angry because you're able to recognize some kind of harm is happening or the potential for harm. And your just kind of natural reaction to that is a sense of outrage and disbelief. And then that manifests itself into anger, and that this will help you to recognize that some kind of change needs to happen, but that change should not be located in the anger itself. We need to quickly move past that and use the energy of the anger to motivate some other kind of response to the outrage. And so possible responses to this seem counterintuitive, but will smother anger pretty effectively. And so there's, things like friendship or forgiveness. She uses a lot of religious examples throughout the whole thing, especially talking about when she gets into this part of the book that's about forgiveness and justice. In particular, she points to the parable of Jesus of the prodigal son. And so in the story, there's a son who takes his inheritance early, and then he gambles it all away and squanders it. And then he's away from home for a long time. And then he goes back to his father's house, destitute and homeless. And when his father sees him, he's so happy because he thought his son was dead, and it turns out he's not, that he doesn't care about the debt. He doesn't care about the profligate behavior. He just embraces him and throws a feast and is excited to tell everybody in the community that his son is alive and his son is home. And so in this way, his anger has been completely bypassed, and the way in which his household has been diminished doesn't matter. He's not asking for retribution for the lost money. He's not trying to cause his son to experience shame or derank him or disavow him as a son. And he's not concerned with the way in which his son's behavior is reflected on him in the community. Instead, he throws all that aside and chooses to concentrate on the connection of love and fidelity between father and son. And so this is a response that we can have to loss and anger, is a response of love. There's nothing that the son had to do to earn this. There's nothing that he probably could have done to earn this in the kind of state that he's in. And then she points out all the ways in which forgiveness in Judaism and Christianity has these associations of transaction with it. And so in order to be forgiven, there are all these conditions that need to be met. And those conditions can be onerous or humiliating. And the point of those ordeals of forgiveness is a kind of working out of the anger of the victims. And so there's a satisfaction in watching the person who wants forgiveness having to go through begging for it and doing various things in order to earn it and playing out all these rituals and stuff. And when you compare that to the prodigal son story, you can see that nothing had to be done for the forgiveness to happen. It was an intrinsic forgiveness that was automatic. And the reason for that is love. And for practical modern day examples of this kind of thing, she points to Nelson Mandela and his time both in prison and after prison, where he was able to make friends with the other inmates and even his own guards because he did not hold them responsible for, him being arrested and the entire regime of apartheid and the way that it had affected his life. Instead, he considered them to be fellow citizens alongside him and as equally worthy of, friendship and respect as every other person. And so basically, he treated them the way that he wanted to be treated and had a genuine affection and enthusiasm for everyone that he met, which completely diffused the defensive anger of his would-be enemies, people like the guards and whatnot, and created an environment where justice and community could be built because there was not this sharp division of oppressor and oppressed. Instead, they were just all one community. And so that's a practical political example of the kind of love that the father in the story is giving to his son, where anger does not really come into the equation, even though the anger could be justified in some sense. There's no actual justification for retribution, is Nussbaum's argument, because it leads nowhere and doesn't produce results that are desirable in the culture. For myself, when I think about anger, I think about the neurological discoveries that have been made around the compatibility between fear and anger and how biochemically in our brain and the parts of the brain that activate, it seems like they're pretty much identical. And so having been raised to be a man, and Nussbaum points this out in the book, I was allowed and even encouraged to be angry. And anger was the primary emotion that I was allowed to have. And so when I behave in an angry way, everyone responds to that in a very kind of socially positive way. Like it really like greases the wheels around me. If I'm nice to people and considerate and kind, that actually makes people uncomfortable because as a man, I'm supposed to take control and literally kind of take control from other people who would otherwise be in charge. And the fact that I don't do that upsets people. They think it's weird. My behavior is strange because I'm not behaving in a controlling and angry way. But my anger was a problem for me and causing all kinds of difficulties in my life. And so through therapy, I learned about the link between fear and anger and how they are just basically chemically the same, but they're just a difference in context, that our mind creates energy out of one and kind of like a freeze response from the other. And so I was brought up to that fear is a bad thing, that being a coward is unmanly, and you shouldn't feel that way. If you do feel that way, you should be ashamed of it. And so whenever I get angry, if I remind myself, hey, actually, this is fear, the anger quickly dissipates out of, that masculine conditioning. And so then my thoughts are able to engage in like, what is the best thing for this situation to, create the kind of situation that Nussbaum is talking about. And so I guess I'm treating my anger as that transitional anger. It's just that I'm using the trick of associating it with fear to get me out of the desire for revenge. But Nussbaum doesn't, there's like one brief part where she makes this kind of link, and it has to do with a novel. And it's really the novelist who's making that link. But in general, Nussbaum is pretty negative on psychologists and psychotherapy throughout the book. And she doesn't see much of a benefit because, in her mind, the psychologist will tend to dwell on anger and its origin points in a person's personal past. And so that is not very fruitful for creating justice in a society. She feels that it just perpetuates cycles or creates new cycles. And she's not very interested, or she's skeptical of the way in which fear operates versus anger, because she says that fear is something that even animals can feel, but that anger requires a more complicated level of cognition, and that perhaps animals can't feel this, and that we are not even really feeling anger as babies necessarily because we don't have the full context of ourselves within a hierarchy of society, and the way that that is being undermined is what creates the anger in us. And so this goes back to the idea of the ranking. And if you are being unranked, then you get angry about that. If someone is being disrespectful to you and saying, oh, you're not a part of the community, you're not a real person, in whatever way that they're doing that, that creates anger, which means that in your mind, you have to have some sense of the other person, yourself, the social ranking, and the relation between all of those elements. And so that's more complicated than fear for Nussbaum. And so those are incompatible philosophically. And while I understand the argument, I'm a little bit skeptical of it in terms of it seems like an over-articulation, and it reminds me of articulations that Aristotle himself makes, which I am also skeptical of his basic claims on lots of stuff, but including anger. He really focuses in on the idea that anger has to do with social rank and status pretty much all the time. And I just don't think that that's actually true. While Nussbaum makes some study of various laws and the interactions of the legal system with anger and the outcomes that are just or unjust as they relate to that, overall, I don't see any kind of like schema in the book for how justice should be deployed vis-a-vis anger, or what we can do systemically to try and mitigate people's anger and reform the justice system away from retribution. It's more that she is establishing causal links and then exploring the spaces that the causal network expands into. And so it's almost more explanatory, I guess, is what the book is doing than giving us like any kind of praxis for what she clearly articulates. It would be a better world. So like if we could all have leaders like Nelson Mandela, then everything would be better, seems to be her claim, but there's no model for which this would be accomplished other than, individuals choosing to behave in the same kind of ways that Mandela did, but no like structural institutional solution that produces people like that, rewards them, and disincentivizes people who don't want to go along with that, which is not a requirement for a philosophical book, but I was kind of waiting for something like that to emerge in the text. Overall, I get her point. While I'm skeptical of the different kinds of anger, and I think that some of her choices for political kind of heroes who refuse to engage with anger in unproductive ways like Martin Luther King and Gandhi. I'm skeptical of the efficacy of these kind of examples. Like they work fine as examples, but in terms of actual political reform, neither of them accomplished their goals really. They're like, to a certain degree, their goals happened, but like in the case of Martin Luther King Jr., he was assassinated and he never had the kind of social authority to enact the reforms that he protested for. And ultimately, it came down to an unelected president making a hard push for the law to be changed that accomplished the civil rights bill. And I'm not saying that like King did nothing to earn that, but I do question have this idea that leaders should be like Nelson Mandela, but where is the reward for that happening? How do we create the funnel to catch politicians who would behave in that way? Because the politician who achieved the beginnings of Martin Luther King's dreams was unelected and did not continue in office. He was so massively unpopular because of the reforms that he pushed through. And King himself was shot, so like this route is extremely unpopular. What can be done in order to popularize it? That's not an issue that Nussbaum is interested in. So the book is stimulating, though. Like you can see, it's got me thinking. It's got me wondering, like, what are the alternatives and how do I engage with these ideas? Are they useful for reform and on like that? So that in itself is a good thing.